Hello, I'm Stephen Roy Goodman, host of Higher Education Today. Welcome back to the education program that connects you to contemporary issues, people, and institutions involved in the world of higher education. Today's show is a special joint production of the University of the District of Columbia and the University of Cape Town. I'm here in Cape Town, South Africa, where we'll be talking about curriculum changes on the undergraduate and graduate levels. Dr. Elelwani Ramagando is Associate Professor of Occupational Therapy at the University of Cape Town. She is also the Special Advisor to the Vice Chancellor on Transformation. Welcome.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Well, we're delighted you could be here. Well, maybe if we could start with the word transformation in your title. What does that mean in South Africa, and what does that mean at the University of Cape Town?
For South Africa, I think transformation means change in response to historical and current inequities that, if left unaddressed, will really mean that injustices can only deepen or extend in ways that will affect generations to come. And from a university point of view, I think transformation is about getting diverse voices within and outside the university being seen to matter in terms of what counts as research and also what is deemed relevant knowledge. And that in doing research and in constructing knowledge, we all reimagine what society ought to look like if all lives matter.
Well, you mentioned knowledge, and as you know, your cell phone is a very powerful device. And I think it's fair to mention and to ask about the politics of it and the technology combined, where on one hand, you think about all the technological growth that's happening, so we don't necessarily need to memorize things like we used to memorize all the time, but it's fair to talk about issues of what is knowledge, what ought knowledge be, and then obviously there's a political component to that. And maybe you could say a word or two about, if you wouldn't mind, about how you're trying to deal with that here in Cape Town.
And I think technology is an important one because it brings up the issue of access. And the minute you talk about access and you begin to acknowledge that not everyone is empowered the same way to gain access to technology, and technology that pretty much these days will determine how far one goes in life, that is political. I don't think it's avoidable to bring politics into knowledge construction. When we do research, which I think is the area of work where universities are given a lot of power by society, we interpret people's lives. Just from the research question that is asked, when one decides this research question is more important than the next, it's already a political judgment. And results that are found, how they are interpreted, there may be different alternative ways to make sense of the same data from different perspectives. So I think politics is unavoidable.
Well, I suspect that probably is true. But I wonder if that's true in all disciplines. Like, we just did a taping, since I've been here, we did a taping about mechanical engineering. And the last time I checked, mechanical engineering isn't exactly as political science or economics or land usage. But would you say that one would want to revisit what the mechanical engineering curriculum would be, as opposed to, or in addition to, the curriculum changes, let's say, for the political science department?
Absolutely. Because a bridge is not only just a bridge. A bridge is designed in ways that may signify values. It's about people gaining access, maybe beyond certain barriers. How that is a barrier for one community and not a barrier for others, Who determines that? Um, Vehicles that will use that bridge, uh, access to different kinds of commuters, whether there will be a bicycle track or not. Those are questions that I think engineers ought to begin to ask of themselves. I know of one example, for instance, in architecture, where people or students were given a task to design a holiday home. So if you are an architectural student who comes from a poor family where you don't go on holidays, you certainly don't own a holiday home, how then do you design such a structure? Um, some homes have one bathroom and toilet, others have several. So, in what goes into curricula, it reflects people's lives. And I think oftentimes those who design curricula from a point of view where they think the world is equal, when actually it's not, that knowledge is neutral, that learners are decontextualized, it can be a problem.
So let's get to the issue of the bridge. That's kind of interesting. So what would you advise the chairman of the department that builds bridges, or let's say there's a part of the University of Cape Town that teaches students how to build bridges. What would you want them to do that they're not doing now?
I would start with the students that they have brought in. I think it's an important starting base, and I'm saying this given that at the University of Cape Town, much has been done to transform the student profile. So whatever it is that is being designed or taught around, in what ways do students in that course connect with these things? What does it mean for them? How have they interacted with such structures? How have they felt that these structures are accessible to their communities or not? How have these structures been seen as ways to enable access or not? That already will bring out important points to consider in revising the curriculum. And I think here I could also use examples from my own profession, occupational therapy, which is a profession that falls within healthcare, where the fundamental belief is that what people do every day, so the ordinary everyday things that people do, impact health in positive ways or negative ways, right? And when we work with people in all levels of care, so acute hospital settings or rehabilitation facilities or in communities or clinics, the idea is to work with people in ways that bring them to a point where they feel that what they do brings meaning into their lives. So if someone has had an injury or has had acquired a disability or born with a disability, or sometimes people who don't even have an impairment but have or live in circumstances that constrain their aspirations, sometimes our work is focusing on those constraints and thinking together to bring down the barriers to enable participation. So for a long time, people were quite, in my profession, were quite happy to draw from literature that comes from Britain and the US. When I studied, I was the only student who spoke an African language, and language being a vehicle of culture, in my class. And a lot of what I was required to understand of the profession was pretty distant to my lived experience. But as a student, I could do very little to change that. So when I came back as a lecturer, I knew that I couldn't ignore the faces that were, looking at me curious and not understanding what it was that I was talking about or bringing as an example. Having mastered the language of the profession, obviously, and coming back as a lecturer, was very attuned to students who feel outside of the academic exercise in occupational therapy.
You raise some interesting points because you could see many, many sides of this and from many political issues. Obviously, the issue of access is a crucial one, but also you're raising the issue of what students are studying once there is access. And that's kind of interesting because, we've seen lots of studies and lots of discussions about the access points. But you're raising something that's, I dare say, a little more provocative in the American context, which is you're asking this university and perhaps other universities to examine the role of what's actually being taught and the construct of that within each of the academic disciplines.
Absolutely. And I think there's richness there. And in my own experience, what I've seen is that everyone stands to gain when there's a diversity of experiences that are connecting with the academic activities. When we allow students who are not the traditional student coming into these programs question and critique what is on offer in relation to what their lives are about and their communities, we broaden access in ways that I think are profound. When you find a student, again speaking about my own profession, occupational therapy, where we will have graduates who go back to their communities and cannot even explain what occupational therapy is in ways that their own families can understand, it is a problem. A question is asked about then how do taxpayers' money contribute to having these graduates coming out of the system. We ought to be concerned and worried and really understand that is a critical and important question to ask because for a public university especially, we can't be looking at the academy as siloed, as a place where scholars and academics really produce knowledge only for its own sake. I think it comes at high cost. And I also think it's deeply alienating for graduates to leave universities and go back to communities and are not able to continue to feel like they're parts of those communities that they come from.
And you think that if the curriculum were to be reformed in certain ways, that certain people would be able to go back to perhaps rural areas throughout South Africa and elsewhere and then be more connected to the communities that they came from originally?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They're interesting conversations that we've begun to have at the University of Cape Town and beyond just my profession, but the health sciences faculty, that we couldn't even begin to have in the past, where we, for instance, would have young people who are studying medicine and are saying to us, by the way, my family consults with traditional healers. This is a tradition of seeking healing that has been with us for centuries. And in studying medicine, I feel I am being forced to disregard the fact that people were able to live without Western medicine. So how does that work? And sometimes some of these students would say, there are certain conditions that I can see cannot be explained in Western ways, and sometimes I consult. And when I've done that, I keep it to myself. It's a secret. And sometimes, even if I miss a day or two because I'm going through a process, I know to go past a physician just to get a note so that I can explain my absence in the classroom. But, so we're forcing people to live a lie when actually we could bring in to the academy those points of disconnect and begin to interrogate exactly what the interface may be between indigenous ways of healing and Western medicine in ways that could enrich and maybe translate in a better sense of well-being for society. And in fact, the picture out there is that more people consult with traditional healers than medical doctors. And we can also not produce enough medical doctors. We're having to bring in doctors from Cuba, for instance, to fill the gap. So I can only imagine that if we began to draw from different perspectives, different experiences to enrich what the academy is about, there's gains.
Well, this is really interesting because I should tell you that you're the second person who's mentioned traditional healers in the context of this show. And you're in good company because the first person who raised this issue was Vusi Malesela, the singer-songwriter.
Of course.
And Vusi and I were talking, I don't know if this part, I don't remember if it made the actual segment or if it was after we finished taping, but he made exactly the same point that you made. I think it was after the taping. He made exactly the same point that traditional healers are an important part of life in South Africa, and that it would be, because we were talking about Ubuntu and what the concept of Ubuntu meant, and his point was that traditional healers are quite important and that we really should investigate that. So you're in good company.
Great.
But I think the question that would be a follow-up to that would be, to a Westerner, and this is a show based in Washington, D.C., the concept of a university studying traditional healers would be an unusual one. And you could imagine that from a Western perspective. So what would you say to an administrator who's watching this in the United States, who's looking at curriculum changes or possible curriculum changes? Do you want them to study traditional healing or traditional healers, or how would you ask them to explore this?
That is a tough one, obviously, because, for me, local context in beginning to inform what the academy is about is crucial. And I think for us in South Africa, traditional healing is paramount because of, what I mentioned, in that society, by and large, draws from that tradition of healing. I'll be very curious about other alternative ways of healing that may be present within the U.S. society that may not have been fully explored. And I would urge those who have influence and can begin to bring in conversations into the academic space that begin to trouble the taken for granted notions of what it means to seek healing.
Well, this is interesting, but you could also expand this line of thought to other types of medicine. You could look at it in terms of acupuncture. You could look at it in terms of herbal remedies. Maybe they're herbal teas or herbs that somehow will help you heal. But not every Western medical school would presumably offer these courses.
No, absolutely. The other very controversial element to this is the relevance of spirituality. I was fortunate to have written a review for a book published in the US. I think it's called Spiritual Transformation and Healing. And it's written from a point of view of different disciplines, neuroscience, theology, anthropology. And it was fascinating in that for the first time, people were beginning to draw from their own disciplinary perspectives to begin to understand why spirituality should not be ignored, even within the academy. And acknowledgement that the American society generally believes that there's a higher entity that can heal, yet people seem to be very shy to pronounce on that. And one fascinating piece of research involved oncologists and patients with cancer, and a number of them who were terminal. And the question that was asked to both sides was, when is it that spirituality would be addressed in a conversation between an oncologist and a patient? And the oncologist said, only when the patient brings it up. And the patient said, only when the oncologist brings it up. So obviously, discomfort around this notion, even as it was very central to how people understood healing, especially when you're probably facing death.
Well, this is really interesting. Again, I want to get back to this notion of the mechanical engineering versus the political science, because I think the average person, both in the United States and in South Africa, could see pretty clearly the issue of political science. Politics, the ANC didn't come to power in 1994 based on just some theoretical notion. It was a political movement in South Africa. People are elected or not elected in the United States based on their political platforms. But I just wanted to revisit this issue, if we could, a little bit about how this intersects with what a department would be doing when they would think that something is just pure knowledge. And I understand your point about it's contextualized, but how do you go about talking to a chairman of an individual department or a medical school and saying, we'd really like to explore more courses about how you deal with patients, when in fact the political constructs are such that people wouldn't take that medical school as seriously if they were to do that, certainly in the West?
I think people need to be very clear about what they mean by politics. Because big P politics, where political parties and voting is involved, is just one element of what politics could be about. But I understand politics more in relation to power and who holds power and who has the mechanisms through which to influence decision. And that happens everywhere. And within every department, there are people with more power than others. Sometimes it's patriarchy, where men are able to exert influence in ways that women can't. How can that question about power that is not balanced be avoided when it affects the academy? It affects what journals for publications are meant to count or not. It affects what kind of research should be valued or not. We've got a long history of skewed understanding of disease because the researchers were men. And where things change about how we understand something because women are involved in the research. So these are not simple, small matters. And I think the other thing to also acknowledge is that as much as we want to believe that knowledge is value neutral, we're lying to ourselves. It's not. I think Giddens, in writing about ideology, made it very clear that, you know, people will push for knowledge that serves dominant interests. How then can we completely disregard the fact that there may be others within our respective departments who feel that they cannot influence what is regarded as good research and important knowledge? And when people look around in their offices, in the boardrooms, and they watch closely who's sitting around the table, whom do they see? Whom don't they see? And what explains why certain people are not represented around those tables? And what does it mean for whatever it is that is regarded care or service to communities that are not represented?
Well, Elelwani, we're not going to be able to continue this conversation today, but this is a start of talking about these very provocative topics. So thank you very much for coming on the show, because I think you do raise some powerful issues, and I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of opinions, and we'll be getting lots of mail about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you would like additional information about Elelwani Ramagando, please visit dhrs.uct.ac.za. If you have comments or suggestions about Higher Education Today, please send an email to our viewer mailbox at highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. Thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. Please join me again for another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm Stephen Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.